welcome everybody to this last event from our speaker series in the Central Latin American and Border Studies. I am Berta Bermudez. I am an assistant professor in sociology here at NMSCU, and I have the pleasure today to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Jeremy Slack. Dr. Jeremy Slack is the department chair and associate professor of geography in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Texas, El Paso. He received his PhD in geography from the University of Arizona in 2015. His research is focused on deportation and the problems forced removal creates for individuals and their families, the connections to place that are severe, and how it has intersected with drug-related violence on the border. His research interests include state theory, illegal and illicit activity, the US-Mexico border, drug trafficking, violence, participatory activist-oriented research methodology, and public scholarship. Dr. Slack's work has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, among others. He has published widely in geography, anthropology, and sociology journals, and he has edited as well In the Shadow of the Wall, Violence and Migration on the US-Mexico Border, which was released in 2018 by the University of Arizona Press. His second book, Deported to Death, How Drugs Violence is Changing Migration on the US-Mexico Border, from the University of California Press, explored the dangers of mass removal from the United States, which has placed millions in danger, and they must, as they most negative, complex, and dangerous regions upon deportation. Today, Dr. Slack will give us a talk named ICE Most Wanted, Scholarship, Bias, and the Legitimacy of Knowledge. So welcome, Dr. Slack, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And so this is kind of a new talk, and I'm excited to share. It's going to be part of my next book, which hopefully will come out within a year or so. And it's a bit of a reflection of my own sort of journey as a scholar who's principally been driven by questions of relevancy, right? How do we as scholars contribute something outside of our simple kind of academic areas? And, kind of reflecting on some of the pitfalls as well as things that I've learned on that package along the way. But start with some quotes here. So DHS has an attack packet against me, right? It's 108 pages long, contains selections of my book, articles, quotes taken out of context, old tweets from a defunct Twitter account, and experts from particularly stringent immigration judges. This packet has been shared dozens of times, especially as I become more and more well-known within different courts around the country as an expert witness that has, particular set of skills related to understanding the dangers faced by people upon removal. Within this packet, the PDF of my book has a distinct watermark from the US War College, noting that it is the same packet that's shared again and again and again between different trial attorneys for ICE. And usually the result is brutally tedious testimony, right? Going through quotes to address them with accusations of bias in my work. And sometimes this is effective within, different perspectives of immigration judge, something I'll talk about in a little bit, but mostly it hasn't been particularly effective in losing cases. And so one of the things that I've always sort of done in this is say that I'm not going to participate as an expert witness anymore if I view it as not being helpful. If it's too much of a distraction, that's an issue. And so this has happened for about 3 years now, when it was first filed in 2021. But it really represents this strategic deployment of the concept of bias, right? Some unique policing of language that occurs within the law, and all of which calls into question basically how scholarship that is can be relevant, can be useful and important, while still retaining a critical approach that's so essential to quality academic work, right? I am a critical scholar. Most of the people that I read and work with are also critical scholars. And so within that tradition, how do we justify the need for critique, right, as being quintessential to academic work. Right? We have to critique the system. We have to come up with a sort of a nuanced understanding of the societal problems that are caused in our society, while being able to present the empirical evidence that has been so useful in your report. And so I'll read one quote from a judge that's included in this packet. And so, I have your report and evidence, and I've ruled that while you may have relevant information regarding the situation in Mexico, that you're not an expert witness. And so because of that, I'm not going to allow you to testify regarding your opinion about respondent's particular case and the facts of the particular case and how they may in fact give him a fear of return to Mexico or not. Right. So here this judge, and in immigration court, it's important to note that the judge is solely responsible for granting asylum or other forms of relief or denial. But this person solely, completely misrepresents what it means to be an expert witness, which is to give background information based on our research or current country conditions related to types of individuals in similar situations, right? This push to make you into a fact witness is something that happens quite frequently, to say that, do you have specific information regarding this case? And it's always important to say no. However, this is often used to push back. And as opposed to criminal cases, right, where you have a Kelly Dobert hearing, which is the finding of expertise. I also testify in quite a few criminal cases. Within immigration court, you sometimes have voir dire. You often have ways that expertise is simply accepted, the report is simply accepted, and you just have wild variations within the ways expertise is treated and accepted within immigration courts. And so these attacks, which are used against me, and strangely not against my co-authors on this article, even though they both do quite a bit of expert testimony, have really centered on this article. Right? This is an article that I wrote in Human Organization. It came out in 2017. It's probably my least cited article too, so it's the one that's kind of the bane of my existence. But I still say that it's a point that I stand behind, right? And so this is something that was written a while ago to really understand how our norms within academic world fit within the norms of empirical evidence presented in court. And this article deals with criminal cases, death penalty cases, as well as immigration cases. And one of the pieces that they always focus on is the statement here at the bottom about making good enough arguments. And so this is a reference to Nancy Shepherd Hughes' fundamental work within anthropology about good enough ethnography. The idea that, yes, there are post-structural challenges to the law. We understand that expertise is created and you can never fully understand things. However, we have good enough information, right? And despite the rules of an expert, which says it has to be specific information, it's very general, right? They want to know basically what's happening in terms of broad strokes, in terms of violence, in terms of potential harm, issues such as kidnapping, issues such as corruption, that for many scholars, this is very elemental information, right? And so often you're asked, do you publish directly about this? And my response is always no, because it wouldn't get published. Everyone knows that already, right? And so how do we find a niche that goes there? But this article in general is used to paint me as somebody who is trying to defend immigrants, right? And so part of this is the use of language. It's very much policed within these courts, that defense, advocacy, what's the other one? Any legal language such as torture that has legal definitions, the likelihood, all have number values assigned to them within the law. And so because of that, anyone using those things is kind of critiqued as having stepped into the legal area and is making legal decisions. So for example, to call people clients, which is what lawyers talk to us about them. So in the article, we refer to them as clients. However, this is something that they take umbrage at within the court system. And so this article, again, is something that I really do believe in. This was written for the Journal of the Society for Applied Anthropology. and represents kind of an idea that we as academics have a lot of information that is very important. We might view it as basic information, but it's something that often doesn't get out there in the courts. And often what we see in terms of people who are involved in applied or activist scholarship is suggestions on how to change things, right? And that's not what being an expert is. It's giving clear empirical evidence of the current situation, which is often overlooked, I think, within academia. And so trying to make that argument and saying that often we do know enough to be able to make a determination about one individual, even though social science in general doesn't deal with one individuals, at least in my field, right? It's always kind of larger groups of people. And so I want to sort of also couch this attempt at discrediting me as well as other experts as well within a kind of a broader context of persecution of immigration rights defenders. Now, I do want to separate this a little bit. I don't view myself kind of in the same category as a lot of people that have been targeted at much more extreme levels. It will be interesting to see in terms of coming administrations how this continues to work out, because this was most pronounced during the Trump administration when they began using the tactical terrorism defense team within the Department of Homeland Security to target immigrant rights activists, different lawyers, and other groups that supported immigration. And one of the biggest examples was when the San Diego Tribune got FOIA documents showing a number of local Tijuana and San Diego activists who had been targeted by DHS. And I put this up there because this was published in the newspaper. And, you know, of course, I know a lot of these people. Many of them had their Sentry cards, their Fast Pass taken away. They were subject to hours of interrogation, put on list. One lawyer was deported from Mexico with her daughter when she was there on vacation, right? And this happened again in El Paso and Juarez, where a lot of sort of local activists have reported invasive strip searches and all sorts of types of behavior aimed at stopping them from doing basic legal representation to migrants, especially as they sent migrants back to Mexico for migrant protection protocol. And so, you know, within this context, I don't want to put myself in that same position. I don't believe that the kind of attacks on me have had that level of kind of personal haven't created that level of kind of personal harm to me in any way. However, I do know very clearly that they personally do hate me, right? This is conversations that come up very frequently when I talk to other experts who, of course, use my work, because there's very little ethnographic work about what happens when someone is deported. And so many of them use my work, reference it, and are attacked for even mentioning me in court. But this kind of broader sort of use of government forces to discredit and stop people who are deemed as problematically supporting immigrants has a longer history, and is something that is kind of cause for concern, and something that's been cause for concern when, like, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies has reached out to me to think about ways to deal with this as a broader trend, and the idea of discrediting academic researchers, because a lot of the experts actually don't have an academic background, right? It's more of an NGO background or a law enforcement background. It's more common. And so having a large record of public and published material is both helpful in that it's very formal and legitimized, but also harmful because then they can go pick through things and try and think of ways in which you are going to be deemed biased. And so my experience as an expert, first came in graduate school when I was approached by lawyers as somebody who knows about kidnapping, but also when I became a professor at the University of Texas, El Paso, got introduced to this sort of field by my colleagues and began doing it many, many times. I think I've done over 250 or 300 cases at this point. And, my own beginnings as an academic came from working on community-based participatory research projects, right? So projects that are really grounded in the community, that are designed to support certain initiatives, and, reading broadly the works of Orlando Falls, Florida, Rahman, or Pulido, Chuck Hale, right? All these people that very much think about how do we use the power of scholarship in ways that are going to kind of be supportive to the broader issues that we see. Now, when we talk about this, we are not talking about inventing or lying or using kind of poor methodological tools, right? That's never implied in any of this, but that's certainly the way that the thinking around what the scholarship of advocacy would be within a legal framework, right? And so I've always used my position to try and find the questions that are most relevant to the people that I'm working, right? How do I, approach things as what is known but is not proven, that we don't have academic data on it? And what are the unknowns? What are things that are emergent that we don't understand as happening? And so this is what led me in general to write my last book. I was doing work with deportees and migrants when the drug war started, right? When we started to have this level of violence, when we started to have people being kidnapped, forced to carry drugs to the desert, this much more organized kind of criminal approach to migration on the border. And that drove me very much to write about these things without understanding how much of this information would be useful in the courts. And so for the talk today, I mean, I'll mostly be drawing on some of my qualitative and quantitative work in Mexico, some studies that are published. I'm gonna use a little bit of a project that involved court observations in the El Paso Processing Center, and reflections from my own asylum cases, right? So really trying to kind of ground this in some of the things that I've been doing. And so to give a quick snapshot, I'm not sure how much people understand the asylum system in general, so I'm going to give a little bit of a background on this, but feel free to ask more questions about this as well. And so there's approximately a 3 million case backlog right now. Some of those are asylum cases, some of those are removal cases. It's unclear where they go. A lot of times you'll see is that cases don't go to conclusion for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. Sometimes people find other ways to regularize. They get married, their children become old enough to petition for them. But last year, there was about 72,000 asylum decisions, right? However, we added about another 2 million removal cases last year, which again, many of those are going to go into the asylum system. So there's no way that we're keeping up, right? We are not keeping up with these issues as well. Now, among that, we see huge variations, right? Probably some of the biggest variations are going to be your country of origin. And this is an example of the United States being so steeped in their Cold War policies still. If you are from a country that has a negative relationship with the United States, an openly antagonistic one, they're much more likely to grant asylum, because asylum has been used as a way to paint countries as human rights abusers. For example, China has 17% denial rating. And historically, a lot of that's been due to an evangelical lobby in the United States that was really against restrictions on the number of children people could have. But it doesn't also mean that there aren't real, pressing problems related to human rights abuses in China. China was the top country for asylum seekers as well. But Mexico and particularly a lot of Latin American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador have had very, very high denial rates. I think Mexico is still the highest. Mexico and Guatemala over historical trends have kind of competed for the highest denial ratings. And so where you're from is going to be a big issue. And so Mexican nationals typically have had very low access to asylum. And then also the other big factor is going to be the judge that you get, right? I pulled up the most stark example within one court that I could find, which is within the San Francisco Immigration Court. So the same court, you file your petition in that area, you're going to get one of these judges. We have Nathan Aina, who has a 91.6% denial rate, and Chloe Dillon that has a 1.2% denial rate.
It's
right?
luck. It's based on luck.
It's based on luck, right? And so individual factors, it's really hard to say that they could actually influence your case, which is just tragic, right? Because one thinks that there is a fair hearing, there is looking at the fact pattern. But these are all people that have, these judges have over 100 cases. I think these people each have about 200 cases a person that are in this database. And so we have to assume that they more or less have similar cases. And yet with one person, you're not going to get asylum, and the other person, you're definitely going to get asylum. Now, there's some deeper structural issues to this as well. There are a number of immigration judges that have never granted an asylum cases, like never. So there are more stringent ones than this. But another big factor too is that overall 81% of non-represented cases are denied, and 44% of represented cases are denied. So if you have a lawyer, you are much, much more likely to win asylum or some form of relief, right? And so this is just how there's this kind of overarching problem with the system, that this element of randomness. There's a great book on this. It's called Refugee Roulette. This is a game of chance. This is not a game of who has the most valid experience of suffering, right? And so just to give a little bit of background, of course, asylum is based on, this definition of a refugee, someone with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. Things about past persecution, this nexus that on account of is the principal piece here. You can't be in danger because someone wants to kill you for you. They have to want to kill you because of X, right? And of course, this past persecution thing is another challenge, right? You need to stay long enough so that you have some form of violence or threat against you, but not too long to where you're killed, right? And so that is that piece that kind of goes into these issues, right? The state has to be involved, right? This is a very state-centric approach, which has created a lot of problems for countries that are experiencing large criminal violence, like Mexico and Central America. How do we paint this as state-driven, or at least state acquiescence? And internal relocation has to be not reasonable. A lot of legal work on what reasonable means there. Most recent stuff is that essentially, if you're hiding, it's not reasonable. You have to be able to go somewhere else and live there, and like go to work and go out. And the biggest issue that I face in my work is defining a PSG, a particular social group, right? And so this is something that has to be immutable. You can't change. You shouldn't have to. There's a social distinction in that the rest of society views you as that. And there has to be particularity, right? It needs to be clearly defined who's inside and outside of the group, right? And that can't be everyone. It can't be broad. And so often what I do as an expert, especially trying to stay away from any legal distinction, is trying to think about the ways in which certain people are viewed within society. Things like whistleblowers, people that report to the police, that challenge, refuse to pay, extortion or kidnapping, things like that. However, within the law, the most common PSG, the most kind of clear one that's been sort of defined is LGBT, right? There is, that's a very clear example of an immutable characteristic that you can't change or shouldn't have to, that people view and understand. And so it's been kind of part of these issues. There's many others. These kind of come and go in terms of how much they'll be accepted, and they're also accepted differently in each circuit. So I can talk about that more if people want. But there's other cases that I deal with as well. One is cancellation of removal. So these are 42B cases where essentially you have to have a continuous presence in the US for 10 years, good moral character. So there's this kind of morality attached. There's a morality attached to both asylum and cancellation, but there's not for the last one. And so you can't have certain convictions. And the removal has to result in exceptional, extremely unusual hardship to US citizens or lawful permanent resident family members. And this is the piece, right, where having a parent removed is not considered extremely unusual hardship. And so usually these cases only win if someone has kind of disability, or they're a caretaker for young children or possibly older people. But this is capped at 4,000 cancellations per year, right? And so it's a very small thing, but this is something that has made it so a lot of people do not view Mexicans as part of the asylum system as well. Because for the longest time, especially during the 90s, Mexican nationals would be encouraged by immigration lawyers to open up removal proceedings and apply for asylum in order to apply for cancellation of removal. There has to be a removal order against you to win this. And it was seen as a way to get into formality if you were undocumented in the United States. It's a terribly dangerous one. And so that practice has been pulled back, because if you lose, then you get deported versus living here undocumented. And it's also one where it kind of started the idea that when Mexicans apply for asylum, they're actually applying for cancellation. And then the other one, which is really kind of, what happened there? It turned into something else. Anyway.
Oh, that's basically the commission.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it looks to understand, right? If you're coming into the immigration court without a lawyer. But the Convention Against Torture is probably where I do the most of my work, right? I kind of specialize on people with criminal records in the United States, especially people who came here as young children, got involved with gangs, committed usually very serious crimes, were arrested, and are now facing deportation back to Mexico, often covered in prison tattoos, with very little knowledge or family structure or contact in Mexico. And so this is a population I work with extensively, especially in Tijuana, people that just don't know about Mexico and have a criminal record and are perceived to be a social threat upon removal. But this is technically a much higher standard. But even in a lot of non-criminal cases, I still win Convention Against Torture more than asylum. And I think a lot of that is because there's a lot of clear evidence that torture is common in Mexico, that the government is either involved or acquiesces to it, and that there can be this more likely than not, this 51% likelihood of that happening to someone. And so this is something that I've seen as kind of very successful from my experience in doing these cases. This will give you work authorization, but you have no chance at citizenship. You just essentially can't be deported. And so it's considered, both withholding of removal and Convention Against Torture, kind of considered harder standards and lesser forms of removal. But we do see them happening a lot with countries where the US doesn't really want to sort of rock the boat and say you are a human rights abuser. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, but I don't know if it's there, but so it says that with the Convention Against Torture, you get work authorization, but that's citizenship or benefits for refugees. But a lot of, or some of the people that you see are green card holders, right? So what happened with their status of permanent residency after, if they win their cases and they stay?
So someone who is CAT only might have had a green card, but it was definitely taken away by a criminal offense, right? So this is the one thing that is left for you if you're a criminal, right? So this is where moral doesn't fit into it. And so a lot of the cases that I get for CAT only are people that have, for example, serious cartel experience, and then they turn to a witness. They report on people. Honestly, I feel like that's a very easy case for me to do and talk about, because you testified against cartel members in court in the United States and they deport you, it's going to be bad. There's no one's going to debate that on the facts. And, it's a very easy kind of argument to make. And so if you have a green card, you're not going to be applying for CAT if you didn't have a criminal offense and they took it away. Now, within court, there's always going to be a lot of debate about what constitutes an aggravated felony, which will cause you to lose your citizenship or cause you to not be eligible for certain types of relief. And so that's something that's constantly fought over. But this is the last ditch status that is available to everybody, right? Now there's other forms of relief, right? Family ties, U visas, T visas, U visas, witnesses, victims of crime, T visas, victims of human trafficking. It's amazing how much the government talks about human trafficking, but does not want to get anyone a T visa, right? They never hit that quota for T visas, and they fight tooth and nail on determining someone as a victim of trafficking. And then also VAWA, violence against women, when the partner is a US citizen or resident. And then, of course, there's also the BIA, which in immigration terms is the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, and it's another body that will look at these decisions and frequently sends them back, right? One thing that's always been a question is, I wish we could evaluate each judge on the number of their cases that get overturned, but that data isn't available for knowledge. And so this kind of restarts the process, especially in extreme cases where there's a lot of errors or legal malfeasance going on. And so during the Trump era too, a lot of what we saw was this kind of changes in how immigration judges had to work. So they instituted quotas, 700 cases annually, which is insane. Like, that doesn't happen. One thing I get criticized for in an article is one of the descriptions that we write about is how expert testimony can take a long time and it can end into kind of prolonging cases. And a lot of people look for experts for that reason, right? Because more time is beneficial to a lot of people. I'm not saying that we try to do that. I don't try and do that. It's a nightmare on my schedule to have to show up 3, 4, 5 times to testify in each case, but it's the way that it functions. And so the idea that they could do 4 cases a day is absolutely insane. During Trump, they also eliminated prosecutorial discretion. So this is ability for IJs and TAs, trial attorneys, and immigration judges to just close cases. And it's been something I think that's gone under the radar in terms of stuff that Biden has done. He's given a lot of latitude. So if you are someone who has a more or less sympathetic case and you have no criminal record and you have good family ties and things like that, a lot of those cases are just getting closed out. And this is, again, kind of a good result versus getting removed, but not the best result. So essentially allows you to stay here with the work permit that you got that you can renew. There's no path to citizenship, but there's no removal order. And so a lot of people take that. And he's been doing about 80,000 cases a year on that, which is, huge because it reduces the court load and reduces some of the backlog. But the way that it was under Trump is the backlog went up. And if Trump gets back in, it's going to explode the number of cases in the immigration court as well. And they also, during Trump, reduced certain types of relief. Now, it's important to note with the judges, this is not part of the judiciary. These are employees of the Department of Justice because the Executive Office on Immigration and Refugee Resettlement, EOIR, is within the DOJ, right? The Department of Justice hires IJs so they can be fired by the Attorney General, right? Only recently were they given kind of pay equities with other federal judges and the ability to have contempt, right? Until even I think 2 or 3 years ago, an immigration judge couldn't hold anyone in contempt of court, right? They had no abilities to do anything like that. And so this means that whoever the Attorney General is can vastly shape the immigration court. It's a very political position. There's a lot of power within that. There's a lot of movement to try and make them into Article 1 courts, which would give them in that level of a civil case, but there's not a whole lot of issues there. And so to give a little bit of sort of research data on this. So there's a subsample of 303 hearings that we attended. I have a student project to go to the detention center in El Paso and sort of watch the master calendar hearings, which is essentially when immigrants are kind of going into the system and trying to determine what path they're going to take. And so of those 303, 224 respondents expressed difficulty proceeding for at least one of the following reasons. So difficulty hiring a lawyer being the most common, difficulty with translating. So there's not a translator there. We're going to have to send you back and bring you in another date. Seeking bond or parole, trying to get released from detention, which is often kind of viewed as a negative. And one immigration judge famously says, if you're trying to get out of here, then your life's not really in danger. Which one can be afraid of being killed, but also not want to be locked up. I think that those are pretty compatible desires. A lot of people struggle seeking help with family, delays in court due to malfunction. One we went to a couple of weeks ago, they randomly transferred someone to the Otero detention center. And so he was no longer in the detention center where his case was, and they tried to put him on WebEx, and all these things are issues. And then also, of course, medical hardship in detention. And so I'm going to read some notes here from there. Judge, do you wish to apply for asylum? Respondent, yes. then why don't you have your application? My family was looking for a lawyer. I wanted to be represented. They promised to come and see me. Nobody came. Well, you have to pay for a lawyer, and they're very expensive. Asylum cases are very expensive. I would estimate anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000. He iterates that lawyers are very expensive, then recommends hiring a lawyer, but he doesn't have to. He can represent himself. Concludes with, but it's your life, your choice. Respondent, I need 1 month. I'll give you 1 month. If your application is incomplete, we'll go with that. In the meantime, work on getting a lawyer to help you. Your application is due at the next hearing. If you don't have it and there is no exceptional explanation for why you don't have it, I will issue a removal. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. And these applications have to be completed in English. There's a lot of kind of confusion about who can actually translate as well. I'll give one more instance too about medical care that happens. So the purpose of today's hearing was to get your asylum application. Did your lawyer send you something to give to me? No, I'm not yet finished with the application. What are you working on? Why is it taking so long? On September 20th, I had a medical complication. I was taken on an emergency out of the detention center in Sierra Blanca. It was found I had kidney stones, gallbladder stones, and an ulcer. The doctor said I need surgery immediately. Judge expressed that he had a similar medical situation. There's another procedure I know from experience. They don't have to cut you open. This one needs surgery, the doctor said. There was a letter sent to ICE on the September 20th. This is November 20th. It'll be 2 months. They have not given me the health care I need. My health condition is getting worse. When I go to the restroom, there is blood. And this person decided to take her deportation rather than stay in detention, right? And so you have all these factors on top of a system that is very likely to deny, that is very random, but also the factors that are inherent in being detained, waiting for cases, also cause people to often withdraw those cases. Now, I want to read some excerpt from an interview that I did yesterday, actually. So I was released in Nuevo Laredo. While I was walking across the bridge, there was an aide taking pictures. He said it was to prove he did his job, but I don't know. They gave us a form, una hoja de deportación, and made us wait in the parking lot. An Instituto Nacional de Migración van, Mexico's immigration authorities, picked Javier and a group of about 10 deportees up and claimed to be taking them to the bus station in Monterrey. However, they stopped at a hotel with big panel doors and the van went inside. 2 men closed the door behind them and approached the van. Immediately, they asked where they were going and who they were there with. One of the men claimed Javier, and the rest of the deportees were divided up. He was taken to a safe house where he was interrogated, and they demanded $10,000 to cross him to the United States. They brainwash you and tell you that it isn't kidnapping, that it's a service for crossing, but they don't let you refuse, and they cross you by force. His wife sold Javier's car in order to pay the ransom. Javier was loaded into a van and walked across the border and held in a safe house before being taken to San Antonio. And so often what I come into contact with are stories like this. They're very confusing, right? Why would you kidnap someone, demand ransom, and then cross them into the United States? But these are things that we see in our research as being kind of emergent phenomenons. And this one very much being tied to the current monopolization of smuggling, right? Human smuggling has become a very profitable business for organized crime. And these individuals indicated that they were with the Cartel Noreste. And Javier had recently crossed through Reynosa with people that were affiliated with the Gulf Cartel. And so once he returned, they did not want him to pay and work with smugglers from a rival organization. And this need to cross people has a couple of different sort of impacts. And we'll see this out, but this is becoming more and more common as people are charged with the criminal offense of illegal reentry, even though it wasn't necessarily their goal to do it, right? And we've seen this conflict play out pretty extensively in Tamaulipas. A couple of years ago, there was a van of 19 people that were burned to death that the state police was arrested for. And I think 17 were from Guatemala and 2 were Mexican. So 2 smugglers and the rest immigrants. And essentially who controls, who is allowed to cross and do these things. And so as an expert, I'm here to sort of provide nuance, provide background, give potential explanations for these things. And it is a fine line, right? This is a case where we don't know 100% what the motivations were of these people, but it is something that I've seen enough times in my own interviews outside of a court setting that I do know to be common, right? And so as an expert, I'm here trying to translate my academic work into the court setting to give some knowledge on this. But if I'm too kind of stringent in my interpretation, that doesn't make sense. And if it's too nuanced, it just becomes too sort of vague and easy to dismiss. And so it's part of this balance for sure. Another important example of this is related to the niños de circuito, so circuit kids. I'll read another expert here. How am I doing on time? Okay. I'll just summarize this. So often I've worked with children that are involved in smuggling and involved in both smuggling drugs, but also a lot of times as coyotes, right? Crossing people over the desert, especially teenage kids, are strong enough, they know the way, and they know they're not going to get arrested in the US, they're just simply returned. And so in a study that we did where we surveyed 100 unaccompanied Mexican minors who've been removed to Mexico, about 30% claim they worked as smugglers. And this is an article we published in 2020. Now the term circuit kids I have used frequently to be a PSG. Right? I think I've won every case that I've worked on where someone was recruited as a child to work for organized crime. And it's often under this idea that this is a particular social group. This is something that people recognize as children participating in organized crime, and they know what it looks like. On the other side, within academia, there's a huge debate about the potential criminalizing and negative consequences of using this term. And so I find this as an interesting entree into this sort of bigger question about how do we deal with the language around harm, right? Within the court system, there is value to these labels, and this is something that can provide real benefit to people. However, often we see within academia is a lot of debate around language and discourse, which makes sense because this is what we do. We talk, we write, we discourse. And so, however, we see this kind of countervailing issue where a lot of the progressive forces don't want to use those labels, which in turn can have negative consequences for people that are trying to use that to seek real benefits and safety. Another issue that we face in court a lot is quantifying harm. This fetishization of quantitative data is huge within organized crime. And so in a study that I did with deportees, we found 7% of them had been kidnapped. Now, as a social scientist, that's insane, right? Like a percentage of people doesn't have extreme events. It's like a percentage of people is not murdered. We measure these in number per 100,000 inhabitants, or even number per 500,000 inhabitants when you talk about kidnapping rates. So a percentage is huge. However, in court, this is often used to say that's not 51%. And so I always have to say, of course not. But when we have individual issues within those groups, it changes, right? And so certainly trying to separate which harm, who is more likely to do this, who's not. And we get down to this issue that's the fundamental problem with quantitative data in immigration court. That's one unique individual. There's not a study of that one individual. There never will be. There are certain traits that they have that they share with other people, but we can't quantify one individual. It just doesn't work. And so let's talk about this issue of bias again, which I think bias is something that we don't really talk about a lot in academia. And the reason for that is we talk about methodology, right? We focus on sampling bias. We focus on confirmation bias. We focus on how you build your study, what methods you use, what information you take, because we have this understanding that all knowledge is going to be situated, that we have our own positionality, who you are and who you're talking to people has become the common way that we talk about potential biases, right? I often write in my book about being a white male in a lot of these spaces and shelters that are religious. And so they're often divided by gender. I don't always feel comfortable or want to go into the women dorms. Sometimes I do if I know people better or there's issues like that in terms of the length of time I've been there. But generally, I try to avoid that, and that shapes my findings. And I want to make sure that that is known to the reader so that they can critique me, right? It's always this piece of show, don't tell your work. However, we kind of see this perverse Foucauldian sort of archaeology of knowledge that happens within the court, right? This pulling apart the epistemic trends that we have in terms of our discipline and putting them in a light that really kind of sort of critiques the production of knowledge as having to come from some perfect source, which of course we don't believe in academia, right? We don't believe that anyone can have a pure, unbiased opinion of a topic that they study. Now, my opinion changes and evolves based on the data, of course, but this sort of approach to both looking at language, when I say torture, it's not the legal definition of torture. I always have to say this, but they still get mad at me for even saying the word torture, which is hard to avoid when it's a Convention Against Torture claim. And so I kind of get to this piece where I worry about the nature of knowledge, right? For the longest time, I had moved to the point where I thought real empirical data is one of the biggest things that we can do, right? How do we get new information? How do we produce data about this messy world around us? And that being a major contribution, even if it's one that, like, academically purely empirical studies, case studies, are often devalued. But I thought that that was something that I think really we should move towards. However, this sort of event really shows how easy it is to discredit and discount that information, no matter how rigorous, no matter how big it is, that there is ways in which our approach to knowledge is so out of sync with mainstream culture, especially the way lawyers view it, that we get to this point where I'm sort of questioning the relevance of producing that knowledge. So, and I still think that there's a lot of value in it, but it certainly shows a lot of the potential harms and challenges of this. Thanks everyone so much. I'd love to leave a little bit of time for questioning. Yeah, thanks everybody for funding and for some collaborators. More on this that I put up there.
So if people have questions, you can type them on the chat, and then I can read them. Do you know if there are questions for no Marta? If not, I have a lot of questions, but
There says there's 5 things in the chat, but I don't know if that's
no, that was me.
okay.
Okay. So if you have questions, please can you post them on the chat? And I do have a question. We can start with that, and then if others want to ask other questions. So I'm wondering, I mean, you've already been targeted as somebody who's biased, and now you're like kind of writing about this reflection and on how they have been targeting you. Are you not afraid, or what are your thoughts about what other outcomes
How writing about it is actually
Yes.
going to make more negative impacts?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? But I have this sort of challenge as a scholar, right? I've been feeling kind of muzzled by the attacks, which I think is a really negative experience as a scholar to have, right? I don't want to self-censor based on the fact that I'm going to be attacked for it. And that's a challenge, right? Because, I always had that critique against a lot of people that I saw as kind of, you saw a lot as policy, but I also saw it with a lot of journalists, like, oh no, I can't talk about that because then I'll be perceived as biased and I can't do that. And this is, and we all know that is, support status quo, right? Being quiet on things is supporting the status quo, like 100%. And so I have this issue, and there's a part of me that might stop doing this or do things like only criminal. Criminal is like real, and immigration court is much more of the Wild West in terms of how things work. And so when you're in criminal court, it's like there is a process, there's a jury, there is kind of a back and forth between legal teams that are there is like financial things that are connected to it, whereas with immigration court is much different. And I see this a lot in other things that I do, right? As an expert, I can work with some NGOs, but I also have to sort of keep my distance. And a lot of people who work with me on cases are very careful to be like, no, we don't. There's no sort of personal crossover and these things. And so a lot of the organizations that I've worked with for many years, became more of direct legal representation, and so I can't really associate with them. Like I get invited to boards and I say, no, I can't do that because I serve as an expert sometimes for you. And so I have that interior conflict around this because I know they will use this to try and attack me, but at the same time, do you not talk about it?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's just like, I know you're being very successful in winning cases, so that's where my question was coming from, like.
Right, and it's one of those things that I do feel proud of, and it's one of the reasons why I stand behind the article that gets attacked a lot, because I do think, as academics, it's easy to fall into this sort of commentator on the sidelines mentality. I can just sort of pontificate on what they do in the NGOs or what the lawyers do. And I don't like that, right? I'd rather be a player in the game, right? I'd rather be somebody that is seen as valuable based on scholarship, which is something that I kind of always wanted to find, and I found that in ways I didn't think would happen. You know, because I spent a lot of time doing work in the media and things like that, and you know, that can be useful in some ways, but in other ways it's just kind of a brick wall. And especially under Trump, when there was no sort of attempt to like modify its perception of this issue, it was all in legal battles. And being someone that, you know, is called upon and useful and has that knowledge and has that skill to be able to do this, you know, I think that that's a worthy thing to do, right? I think a lot of academics should do this. So it is a bit of a crisis for me. Like I feel very kind of conflicted.
I can see that. Thank you so much for sharing. We have a question, right? Can you read it, Marta?
From Tricia Sulpicio, what can, and this question says NMSU employees, but employees in general, do to support immigrant populations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. I think around here, there's certain donations, volunteers, different organizations. There's some of the shelters like with Border Servant Court, you know, support for places like Annunciation House that are kind of the latest iteration of this attack by state, you know, this time state, but government officials to accuse them of being smugglers. Donations are important. Money's important. If you want to donate to shelters, especially in Mexico, the thing that they were asking me the other day is always underwear, sports bras, because socks, because those are things that you can't get used very well. They can't really use government funds to buy them very easily, and they just never have enough, right? And so donating new underwear, huge. So you know, I think there's the sort of donating support side, volunteering, helping make meals. That's great. Driving people to the airport or the bus station, it's great. And then there's the kind of bigger question, I think, where like, depending on your role, what can you do that other people can, right? And that's a kind of a more personal and kind of question. And I always say that, you know, I like to volunteer and help, but I can't drive anyone to the airport better than anyone else, right? And so I was always trying to think of like, how does my scholarship actually contribute more than if I were just a regular person that would do this in my spare time? I think that's something that actually a lot of scholarship has forgotten, as well as the move towards like activist scholarship goes on, where it's more commentating on my experiencing as moonlighting as someone in an NGO. And that for me leaves a big question is, well, then why aren't you just an activist? Because a lot of people do that. And so how do we contribute something new? And that's a harder question. So, you know, as an employee, there's a lot of ways to kind of think about outreach to student populations, depending if you're a teaching facing role, if you're in a support facing role, like things like the camp program are great. Ways to provide support for students, ways to provide support for the kind of the broader situation. It's huge.
So how do you think professors can not, well, how would someone end up being an expert witness like you?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm trying to like recruit a lot of people to take my place. I've been just passing on. I'm also chair now, which is brutal. So, ask me. and say, hey, I'd like to do this. There's places like the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies where you can sign up and create a profile about the types of things you're interested in. I was thinking of doing maybe some trainings that are really, really kind of focused on what are the types of things you need to get across. How do you approach this? What's the basic law side of it? Because, you know, one thing that always came out to me, for example, was like, oh, so it's dangerous for everybody. It's like, so especially when I write about deportation, right? It's like, it's not a fun experience, right? It's bad. Like you're dropped off in a city you don't know, in a place you don't know, you got to sort of navigate and find things, and it can be very dangerous. Is it a 51% danger? Probably not. Like, no, like it's a 7% danger, but that's terrifying if you're an individual. So under the law, that doesn't get you protection. And so you have to be very clear about it's bad for people, but that doesn't mean that they're eligible for this type of relief, right? And so being discriminatory is something that we're not used to doing as scholars. And so I've been thinking about doing, maybe moving into more of that as something to do, but also, you know, I think one of the things that's really important is to look at research questions that are relevant to this, right? And so post-deportation research is something there's actually not a lot on. And I think that's something that's super useful because a lot of times people don't even know like what happens when you deport someone, right? What they walk across the bridge, they get a piece of paper, and then where do they go, right? And that whole thing, and like what do they have to do to rebuild their identity? What do they have to do to kind of get a new birth certificate, get a credencial electoral? Well, they can't right now because it's an election. Things like that that people don't even know that they need to know, right? And so I think choosing your topics, choosing what you study, there's a lot of ways that you don't have to have a ton of information to be an expert. I would be cautious about it. But you know, a lot of people had done that, were like top experts in the field and had never been to Mexico. There was one that came out that way. So and there's another one that was like embezzling money from Venezuela.
But that's a wonderful idea, Jeremy, because it's not only about knowing or having the knowledge, but how you deliver that knowledge to these courts. And it's really, really hard. And so having somebody who can guide you through the process and like, this is what you need to expect if you're an expert witness. And this is what the kind of questions you may be asked and how to respond to those. Because and on my very short experience in this is like, it doesn't matter how much you know, but how well you deliver this knowledge in a language that you're not used to.
Right, and it is a completely new language, right? The way that that language is used and owned and controlled in law is very particular, right? Like, you know, when they had the Supreme Court case about what likelihood of harm constitutes persecution under asylum, they came to, you know, 10%, 20%, you know, depending on the standard. So there's like a number attached to a lot of these things, the words that you're using. And so you don't even know that when you go into these places like extremely likely, that often has a number when you say these things. And so, you know, learning how to translate between these two worlds, I think is fundamental. You know, I've done things like I put a lot of my statements online through CGRS and other places. Like, so I worked on matter of LEA, which was the case that I think it was Barr overturned. So Bill Barr, Trump's second attorney general, overturned a case that had said you're being persecuted because of your ties to a family, which is crazy, right? Because that's what most people think of when they think of asylum. Like, they killed my family, they're going to kill me too. That was overturned, so they couldn't use family as a justification for membership in a particular social group. And I worked on that case, and eventually we won. It got overturned. And then Merrick Garland came in and just sort of did away with that. But even in the time, a lot of judges were like, I can't do this job and not have family as something there. So I try and put that stuff online and try and work with people, but you know, it's kind of interesting thing.
We have
Yeah.
another question. So from Adrian Juarez, you mentioned, sorry if I butcher this, Foucault's archaeology of knowledge. My question extends from the discussion found in the order of things. Apologies for the oversimplification, but do you think that evolution of the asylum seeker as a conceptual figure changes due to the American understanding of this figure, or are changes due to the person in themselves? For example, a Haitian asylum seeker and their racial characteristics affecting their acceptance in whatever context they find themselves in, ports, detention centers, etc.
Yes, that's a great question, a great point in there. I kind of sped through that, but it's a piece I'm thinking about a lot more about the epistemological roots of how knowledge is viewed, right? And thinking about the order of things, especially for Foucault, right? This generation of Western thought, right? How we got to this point of Western thought that is like, medicalized, biopolitical, that is very kind of scientized in a lot of ways. And does things like discounting qualitative information, things like that. And those figures are certainly constructed within this system. And it does change based on the president, right? Like, Trump shithole countries is a big factor in this. So race is huge. It doesn't always function the way we think it's going to, right? So currently, the Biden administration, which has the NHCV program, so Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and Venezuela, they have a specific quota for people from those countries that are allowed to kind of come in more easily through the CBP1 app. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. And those are mainly, with the exception of IT, which is just kind of just a really challenging case, they're all communist or socialist countries, right? They're countries that we've traditionally had bad relationship with their government and therefore taken people in more. And so often being kind of from a country that's constructed in the minds of US citizens as worse, we're more likely to accept you here, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? And especially counterintuitive within the way aid organizations work and the sort of like animosities that are created within groups as they come. But the biggest thing that I see that is just very peculiar to me in terms of how knowledge is created around asylum these days is just a fundamental lack of understanding the basics of you cross over the river and you apply for asylum. And both Trump and Biden tried to restrict or eliminate the ability to cross between ports of entry and apply for asylum. And the Supreme Court keeps kicking it back because there are laws passed around this. There's no way you're going to get rid of that without congressional action. And so the idea of illegal immigration being the problem, the idea of Abbott being able to stop people by putting troops there is just crazy, right? They might send them to jail. And this is what happened under Operation Lone Star during Title 42 when they were sending people back because of pandemic restrictions. They would get held in jails for a couple days, and then instead of being sent back to Mexico, they'd be released, right? And so they would just be able to go on. So it was much more favorable to them to be arrested under Operation Lone Star than to be caught by the Border Patrol and just sent back, right? And so these ways in which people sort of even think about it lack the basic understanding of the facts that are going on, right? And so it just seems impossible to really understand how those categories are created in terms of knowledge when there's so much sort of disingenuous politics at play within this. That's a very good question, for sure.
And then I have Paul Carola. Do courts consider all the mental health needs of migrants as they're applying for asylum? Are they given any accommodation, i.e. extensions, as they complete their application? Also, what mental health services are provided to migrants during the asylum application process?
So none provided for free, but certain organizations support that. Now, there's a couple things you can get in the asylum process if you have the support to get mental health evaluations. So one of the big ones for a long time was Franco designation. So if you are found to be incapable of representing yourself, they would provide you with a state-funded attorney, expert, everything else. So you get money to support your case. Changes by jurisdiction. So it's only called Franco in, I forget, I think it's the 9th Circuit and another circuit. And then other places, they have different names for it. So that is something that can happen. Now, the process of you being able to be determined mentally incompetent is very tough. And so it takes either a judge that's willing to say, hey, I think this person needs to see someone, and then they see someone that can make that determination. Or you have like a long history already documented and you're able to kind of produce that. So most people, no, most people get nothing. Now, a lot of applications will include a mental health evaluations from either a social worker, or a psychologist, or a psychiatrist that's looking at issues of PTSD and these things. And because harm is cumulative in asylum cases, that information matters. It's very valuable. That's another thing. If people want to be involved in doing that, I think from the social work side, there's a huge need for more mental health evaluations because they get very expensive, right? And especially if people are paying out of pocket. You know, one of the benefits is certain states have taken it on themselves to fund these. So New York and California fund with public defender money immigration cases. They're not quite a universal representation, but they're getting there. And that has a huge impact, huge impact. So I work a lot with the Alameda and San Francisco County Public Defender's Office, kind of a good relationship with them. And, you know, they fund a lot of these things, and it makes it really good to do kind of low bono cases with federal attorneys that are also getting paid, that you don't have to deal with that issue as opposed to private. So you can, those things are very needed in the courts, and they're very limited. It's very hard to win a case just on a mental health PTSD diagnosis alone, because it's like, what's the likelihood of future harm on these things?
Oh, okay. So we have like only like 4 more minutes, and I wanted to close with one question that I know you've been thinking about this question for a while. So and the asylum system as we have it right now, we know it's insufficient. And so what other paths or what other ways the United States immigration system should develop or have to do not only rely on asylum?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially because I often get the question is, how do you fix the asylum system? And I'm not that interested in fixing the asylum system, right? I mean, I am, but I'm much more worried about the fact that people are going into the asylum system as a last and only resort, right? So we need to have other options, other opportunities for people that are not necessarily through the asylum system. Because what the rise of asylum on the border has done is just put these millions and millions of individuals into a system. It's just so costly, so difficult. It's traumatic, right? Like, people will, you have to be cross-examined about the most traumatic events of your life, right? Where they get brutal in terms of, you know, talking survivors of sexual assault, like about every detail and trying to belittle and sort of minimize your experience. It's awful, right? Talking about your loved ones being murdered or tortured, all these types of things. And so having anything else to get people away from that is huge. Talking to people, a lot of people that are applying for asylum don't even know what it is or how it works. There's a huge need for easier work visas, right? I know work visas are problematic, but at the same time, it's kind of what a lot of people want and are sort of aiming for. Then you have to deal with problems of, you know, control of employers over people, the ability to kind of decide you want to stay on afterwards. These are other questions. But a lot of people who kind of initially come here do want to work, like economic motives, because all of our decisions to migrate are overdetermined, right? If I'm going to move to another country, I'm not going to have one reason, even if that one reason is violence. I'm still deciding where I want to go because of that violence, right? So if I'm in Mexico, I'm not, do I want to go to Guatemala or do I want to go to the United States? Well, United States, I might have a primo, a cousin, somebody that can give me work, there's better prospects for it, right? And so people need some ability to do self-determination within this and without being called illegitimate. But, you know, pathways to citizenship, reforms to our overall system, making it easier. And I think a lot of this is really unsexy work. And credit to the Biden administration for a lot of things like being able to file petitions online. Like a lot of random little things that are very in the weeds bureaucratically have been improved in the Biden administration. He doesn't get credit for it because it's too complex for people to even understand. And so there's this bureaucratic management system that I think needs to be in place at the border to be able to kind of sort through a lot of people, view who has what type of options, create a different array of options so people aren't stuffed into one system that doesn't fit them, and then be able to sort of sort through that, right? And I've always said too, if you're a security-minded individual, most people that aren't dangerous being able to go legally makes it much easier to find people that could potentially be harmful, right? Like that's just a fact. And so for our kind of biggest goal, which I think mine is to sort of reduce violence, reduce human suffering, create a safer border, then that should be the approach.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. Slack, for being here today. Thank you very much for all the people who follow us over Zoom. I want to thank Dr. Neil Harvey and Dr. David Ortiz for facilitating this talk today. And see you on the next speaker series.